Story 1: The Whispering Walls. When I first bought the house, I couldn't believe my luck. It was this gorgeous old Victorian tucked away in the woods, exactly the kind of place I dreamed about. The price was suspiciously low, but I figured it was because it needed a little work. I didn't think much of it. In hindsight, maybe I should have. The first night was peaceful, mostly. I unpacked a few things and settled into the living room with a glass of wine. The house creaked a little, as old houses do, and I could swear I heard faint murmurs. At the time, I told myself it was just the wind or old pipes. You know how your mind plays tricks on you when you're alone in a strange place. But as the nights went on, the whispers got clearer. I'd be lying in bed, and the murmurs would seem to seep from the walls, just quiet enough that I couldn't make out the words. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I pressed my ear against the wall, and what I heard made my blood run cold. "She's here, watching us. Should we tell her?" I stumbled back, heart pounding. It had to be in my head, right? Maybe I was overtired, stressed from the move. But it didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I mean, who wouldn't? I grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar and started pulling off a section of the living room wall. What I found behind it still haunts me. The space was cramped and dark, almost like someone had built a hidden room. Inside there were things. Strange things. Old dolls with cracked faces and missing eyes. Rusty knives, as if someone had just left them there to rot. And letters, handwritten ones in a language I couldn't read. But the worst was the photo. It was of a family, a mother, father, and 2 kids. Except the kids' faces were scratched out, like someone had violently tried to erase them from existence. That night, the whispers turned into voices. Clear, angry voices. I couldn't sleep. They were everywhere, coming from every wall in the house. "Why did you disturb us? You shouldn't have touched our things." I was terrified, but I needed answers. The next day, I called a local historian to ask about the house. When I explained what I'd found, he went silent for a long moment before telling me the truth. Apparently, decades ago, the house belonged to a family. The parents were cruel. They used to punish their kids by locking them in the walls. One day, the kids never came out. They suffocated in those walls, and the parents, well, the guilt must have been too much. They took their own lives not long after. The historian begged me to leave the house, but I couldn't. I don't know why. I felt like I needed to stay, like the house wouldn't let me go until I uncovered everything. That evening, I found an old door in the basement, boarded up like someone wanted to hide whatever was behind it. I pried off the boards and found a tiny room, empty except for a dusty mirror on the wall. When I looked into it, I didn't see my reflection. I saw the kids. Their faces were pale and hollow, and their mouths were moving like they were trying to speak. Then everything went to hell. The walls upstairs started bleeding this thick, black liquid. The voices were deafening now, screaming at me to get out. I ran. I didn't even grab my things. I just bolted out the front door and never looked back. That house still stands, but no one lives there. People in the area say they hear whispers when they walk by, like the walls are alive. I don't know what's worse, the fact that I disturbed them or the feeling that they're still waiting for someone to come back. Story 2: The Shadow in the Window. I never believed in the supernatural, at least not until I spent that summer at my grandparents' house. It was an old, creaky place on the edge of a small town, surrounded by dense woods. They had lived there their whole lives, and to them the house was just home. To me, it always felt off. The first thing I noticed was the window in the upstairs hallway. It looked out onto the backyard, but there was something wrong with it. No matter the time of day, the glass always seemed dark, like it absorbed the light. And then there were the smudges, long finger-like streaks on the inside of the glass. I cleaned them off more than once, but they always came back as if someone, or something, was touching it from the other side. One night, I woke up thirsty and went downstairs for a glass of water. As I passed the window, I froze. There was a shadow, a figure, standing on the other side. It wasn't my reflection. It was taller, with long, distorted limbs. Its head tilted slightly as if it was watching me. I don't know how long I stood there staring at it. I wanted to move, to scream, but my body wouldn't listen. Then it moved. It raised a hand, long and thin, and pressed it against the glass. I swear I felt the cold seep through even though I was a few feet away. I ran back to my room and locked the door. The next morning I told my grandparents about it, but they just brushed it off, saying it was probably my imagination or a trick of the light. But I knew better. That wasn't my imagination. Over the next few nights, it got worse. The shadow wasn't just in the window anymore. I'd see it in the corners of my room, standing silently, watching me. Sometimes I'd hear faint scratching sounds on the walls, like it was trying to get in. One night, I woke up to find my door wide open. I know I had locked it before bed, I always did. My heart was pounding as I got up to close it, but as I reached for the handle, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I turned around and there it was, standing in the middle of the room. It had no face, just a blank, shadowy void where features should have been. I don't know what happened next. One moment I was staring at it, and the next I was waking up in the morning light, lying on the floor. I told my grandparents I couldn't stay there anymore, and I left that same day. They didn't argue. In fact, they seemed relieved. A few months later, my grandfather passed away and my grandmother moved out of the house. It's abandoned now, overgrown and forgotten. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see that shadow in the window watching me. Story 3: The Silent Guest. When I moved into my tiny studio apartment in the city, I thought I was finally getting my fresh start. The place was old and a bit run down, but it was cheap and in a good location. I didn't mind the creaky floors or the occasional draft. It was perfect for me, at least at first. It started with little things. I'd come home to find the lights on, even though I was sure I had turned them off. Sometimes I'd hear faint footsteps in the middle of the night, but I convinced myself it was just the neighbors. Old buildings like that tend to carry sound, right? One night, I woke up to the sound of someone breathing. It was faint but unmistakable. My heart was racing as I lay there, too scared to move. When I finally worked up the courage to look around, the room was empty. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A few weeks later, I started noticing strange marks on the walls, scratches like someone had dragged their nails down the plaster. They weren't there before, and they weren't something I could just ignore. One evening, I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone when I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I jumped up, spinning around, but no one was there. My apartment was empty, yet the feeling of being watched was suffocating. I decided to set up a camera while I slept, just to prove to myself that nothing was there. The next morning I checked the footage. At first it looked normal, me tossing and turning in bed. But around 3 a.m. the camera glitched, and for a few seconds, there was a figure standing by the foot of my bed. It was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that stared directly into the camera. I moved out that same day. Whatever was in that apartment, it wasn't something I wanted to stay and understand. To this day, I still get chills thinking about that figure and the cold hand on my shoulder. Story 4: The Room That Didn't Exist. It was my first time staying at the old hotel in the mountains. The place had a rustic charm, but it was eerily quiet. I was the only guest that night, which the clerk explained was common during the off-season. It didn't bother me. I liked the solitude. The clerk handed me a key to room 204 and wished me a good night. The hallways were dimly lit, and the carpet muffled my footsteps. When I reached the door, I noticed something strange. The numbers on the plaque were scratched, almost illegible, as if someone had tried to remove them. I hesitated but eventually unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was normal enough. A bed, a dresser, a small TV. But something about it felt wrong. The air was heavy and there was a faint metallic smell like rust. I tried to ignore it and unpacked my things. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise. It was faint, like someone whispering. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The whispers were coming from the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed darker than they should be. I grabbed my phone for light, but as soon as I turned it on, the whispers stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I went to the front desk to ask if anyone had been in the room next to mine. The clerk looked confused. "Room 204?" he asked. "That room hasn't been used in years." I blinked at him. "What do you mean? I stayed there last night?" He shook his head. "You must be mistaken. We closed off that wing after an incident." When I pressed him for details, he hesitated before finally telling me the truth. Years ago, a man had stayed in room 204. He was found dead, hanging in the closet. The staff discovered his body days later, after guests complained about the smell. Ever since, people reported strange things, whispers, shadows, doors opening and closing on their own. Eventually, the hotel stopped renting out the room entirely. I demanded to see the room again. He reluctantly agreed and led me upstairs. When we reached the door, my stomach dropped. The key I had been given didn't fit. The clerk opened the door with his master key, and the room was nothing like I remembered. It was dusty and abandoned, with furniture covered in white sheets. The bed was bare and the air was ice cold. I left the hotel that same day. To this day, I don't know how I ended up in that room or who, or what, was whispering to me. I just know that I'll never go back. Story 5. The Doll in the Attic. When my family moved into the old farmhouse, I was thrilled. It was big and full of character, with creaky wooden floors and an attic that begged to be explored. My parents warned me not to go up there until they could sort through the boxes left by the previous owners, but curiosity got the better of me. The attic was dusty and dim, with a single bulb dangling from the ceiling. Most of the boxes were filled with junk, old clothes, books, broken furniture. But in the corner, sitting on an old rocking chair, was a doll. It wasn't like any doll I'd seen before. Its porcelain face was cracked, and its eyes were black, empty holes. Its dress was faded and torn, but its mouth was painted in a sinister smile. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I told myself it was just an old toy. I carried it downstairs to show my mom. She took one look at it and told me to put it back. Her voice was sharper than I'd ever heard, and it startled me. I didn't argue. I put the doll back in the attic and closed the door. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I thought it was my parents, but when I opened my door, the hallway was empty. As I turned to go back to bed, I saw it, the doll sitting at the foot of my bed. I screamed and ran to my parents' room. They didn't believe me at first, but when they saw the doll, their faces went pale. My dad took it outside and burned it. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. The next night, I heard the footsteps again. This time they were heavier, louder, and accompanied by a soft, raspy voice humming a lullaby. I stayed under my covers, too scared to move. When I finally worked up the courage to look, the doll was back, charred and blackened but still smiling. We moved out of that house a week later. My parents never talked about what happened, and neither do I. But sometimes, I hear that lullaby in my dreams and I wake up wondering if the doll is still out there waiting for me. Story 6. The Echoes of the Past. I inherited my grandmother's old farmhouse last year. It was nestled at the edge of a small town, surrounded by sprawling fields and dense woods. The house had been in the family for generations, but I hadn't visited since I was a child. Stepping inside felt like walking into a time capsule. The air was thick with dust and the wooden floors creaked under my feet. Family portraits lined the walls, their eyes seemingly following me as I moved from room to room. There was something comforting yet unsettling about being there alone. One evening, while sorting through boxes in the attic, I found a leather-bound journal belonging to my great-grandfather. It was filled with sketches of strange symbols and notes about local folklore. One entry caught my attention. It spoke of a hidden room beneath the house, a place of secrets and shadows. Intrigued, I began searching for any signs of this hidden room. After hours of tapping on walls and floors, I noticed a hollow sound beneath an old rug in the study. Pulling it back, I discovered a trapdoor. Against my better judgment, I opened it and descended the creaky stairs into darkness. The air grew colder with each step. At the bottom, I found a small chamber lit by a single flickering lantern. The walls were covered in those same strange symbols from the journal. In the center of the room stood a pedestal with an ornate box. As I reached out to open it, a whisper echoed around me. "Leave this place." I froze. The voice was neither male nor female, but something else entirely. Gathering my courage, I opened the box to find an old pocket watch, its hands frozen at midnight. Suddenly, the lantern extinguished, plunging me into darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled to find the stairs. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "You shouldn't be here." I stumbled up the steps and slammed the trapdoor behind me. My heart was racing and my hands shook uncontrollably. I decided then that I would leave the house first thing in the morning. That night I couldn't sleep. The house was alive with sounds, the creaking of floorboards, soft footsteps outside my door, and faint whispers seeping through the walls. At midnight, the pocket watch on the bedside table began to tick. Its hands moved backward, and the whispers coalesced into a single word: "Remember?" Images flooded my mind. A family gathered around the fireplace, laughter turning to screams, shadows engulfing the room. I saw my great-grandfather performing some kind of ritual in the hidden chamber, the strange symbols glowing ominously. I realized that whatever he had done was still lingering in the house, a darkness passed down through generations. And now it had its sights set on me. Desperate to end it, I returned to the hidden room, pocket watch in hand. I placed it back on the pedestal and spoke aloud. "I return what was taken. Let this end with me." The room grew colder, and for a moment, silence enveloped me. Then a soft sigh echoed around me, and the lantern reignited on its own. When I emerged from the chamber, the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. The house felt lighter somehow, as if a weight had been removed. I left the next day, locking the door behind me. I haven't been back since, but sometimes in the quiet moments between wakefulness and sleep, I still hear that whisper, "Remember?" Story 7. The Haunting Melody. Music has always been my escape. As a pianist, I find solace in the melodies that flow from my fingertips. So when I inherited an old grand piano from a distant relative, I was thrilled. The instrument was beautiful, an ebony Steinway with ivory keys that seemed to glow under the soft light of my living room. The first time I played it, I noticed something strange. There was a sheet of music on the stand that I didn't recognize. The notes were intricate, forming a complex melody that was both haunting and beautiful. Drawn to it, I began to play. As the music filled the room, I felt a chill run down my spine. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, and the air grew thick. But the melody was captivating, and I couldn't bring myself to stop. Over the next few days, I found myself obsessing over that piece. I played it over and over, each time discovering new layers to its composition. Yet, with each rendition, odd things began to happen. Objects in my house weren't where I'd left them. Doors I'd closed were suddenly open. At night, I heard faint whispers just beyond the edge of hearing. One evening, as I played the haunting melody, I saw a figure reflected in the piano's glossy surface. A woman standing behind me. Startled, I spun around, but no one was there. Convinced I was overworking myself, I decided to take a break from playing. But the silence was unbearable. The melody played incessantly in my mind, a relentless loop that drowned out all other thoughts. That night, I woke to the sound of the piano. The melody echoed through the house, each note more forceful than the last. I crept downstairs, heart pounding. The piano keys moved on their own, pressed down by invisible fingers. The woman appeared again, this time at the piano bench. She was pale, almost translucent, with sorrowful eyes that seemed to look right through me. "Help me," she whispered. Gathering my courage, I asked, "Who are you?" She pointed to the sheet music, the haunting melody I'd been unable to escape. "This was my final piece," she said. "He took it from me. Trapped me here." "Who?" I asked, but she began to fade. Determined to understand, I researched the piano's history. I discovered that it once belonged to a composer who was accused of stealing his wife's work. She was a brilliant pianist who died under mysterious circumstances, and rumors swirled that her spirit lingered, seeking justice. Realizing that the melody was her creation, I knew what I had to do. I organized a small concert and performed the piece, crediting it to her name. As I played, I felt her presence beside me, her fingers guiding mine. The audience was captivated, moved to tears by the haunting beauty of the music. When the final note resonated and faded, a profound peace settled over me. Back at home, the piano was silent, and the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. I never saw the woman again, but I felt that her spirit was finally at rest. The melody no longer haunted me. Instead, it became a cherished part of my repertoire, a tribute to a silenced talent whose voice was finally heard.